Alright, I'm going to go ahead and remove these bolts that hold everything together. And just before I do, I went ahead and removed the wire, which is supposed to be a cutter key, from this little short piece of linkage into the leaf spring on the governor, because usually it's easier to take this apart and disassemble it on the bench. Sorry, my arm is in the way. Don't really want y'all to look at my elbow. Alright, you can certainly see why it would make sense to take the hood off so you can actually see what you're doing with this process. And this is possible, it just takes a little contortion abilities, I suppose. Be careful not to take out any wires. So, now that we've got this out, we can go work on disassembling. Essentially, there is a bolt and a washer and a compression spring, and you've got two dowel pins that go through this back plate. There is a cap screw right here and a nut that's actually welded onto it, and that essentially is your throttle stop to limit your maximum speed. So when you push the throttle lever forward, it actually comes back up in here underneath your dash, and you can just make sure that your engine does not over rev. So here we are disassembling the throttle speed control. First thing I'm going to do is work on removing the ball joint, and this one here is a little loose. Very often, if they're pretty sloppy, I would advise to replace. Steiner has this part available, and we took the bag apart, but it is JDS 2695 is the part number right here. A brand new swivel, nice and shiny, and exact replacement for the original. Very important little part, because if it happened to come loose, you would have no throttle control at all. So that being said, it threads out of this plate right here. It's important to keep in mind which side everything attached to, since all that is very important. And we'll want to go ahead and remove these two jam nuts, and basically this is just a bare bore through there, not threaded, and the two jam nuts hold it fore to aft in making adjustments to the speed control linkage, which we'll talk about later. To disassemble this, now I've had this apart previously and put a different friction plate in, but it's important to note that I used an impact wrench here because that was all bound up and it was not pretty. And I'll say, you know, this is Hollywood right here, because I've already put anti-seize on this cap screw. In fact, I replaced the cap screw because the original was in pretty sad shape. If your spring is really rusted, and this is probably borderline, you might consider replacing it with an OEM. And in fact, how nice, my spring is broken, so we'll probably be getting that one new if possible from OEM. If not, we may just live with it. But I do recall, when having done this procedure before, that these two little dowel pins, as they get rust pitted, somewhat similar to this surface, it's not pretty. And what meaning that when you have to disassemble them, to separate these two parts can be a real pain. So what I recommend, the exposed part of the dowel pin, take some emery cloth and remove some of the rust so that it comes apart easier when you get it to that point. Try not to damage this portion, this little formed piece of metal, just for the sake of it's pretty important in establishing your throttle control. You also, after you get it disassembled, you'll usually find there is usually no friction material left. And once in a while people use a piece of old leather in there, but I found that that's usually kind of a short-term fix. Something you may want to do to address these two surfaces, because they actually wear against this friction plate, is that you take a die grinder or something, emery cloth of that nature, shine those up. When you get everything disassembled, go ahead and take a piece of emery cloth and hold it on these dowel pins and clean the dowel pins so that they are free, and everything goes back together nice. You notice I've installed anti-seize on those pins to make everything float, because as you adjust spring tension, this moves in and out. So that being said, that's really the gist of it. So what we'll do is, in the meantime, for the sake of the video, we'll go ahead and take these two adjusting nuts loose off this throttle, this rod. Probably go ahead and if you have a sandblaster, it'd be a good idea to sandblast the threads on here, or if you simply just want to put it in a vise and chase it with a die to clean the threads up, because you'll need these for adjusting later on. Alright, so now that we're working on the throttle control, it's also important to note the governor leaf spring. There's a leaf spring that puts a given amount of tension. Basically, when you push your throttle lever forward, it puts tension on the leaf spring, and then that acts against the flyweights inside your governor. Now, over the last 50, 60, however many years on your tractor, metal fatigues and it gets weak. And if you're not able to get a good throttle response out of your governor, there could be other issues, but sometimes I found just a leaf spring really makes a big difference. So that being said, we have a new leaf spring here from Steiner, part number JDS 1068. Brand new, made the same specs, same metal qualities as the original stuff. So what we need to do to remove the leaf spring, we'll need a 3/8 wrench and a 9/16, and I think this is right for most all other models. What we'll do is there's a jam nut and a set screw, so you break the jam nut loose, which I've already done, and we take the set screw out. This one here is nice and tight. Okay, once you break it loose, we get it all loose. Now it's important not to move this cast iron arm on the governor shaft, because the set screw keeps the two in relationship with one another. I'll show you in just a second. The end of that set screw is tapered to a point, and there is actually a dimple in the shaft, so just leave that be. Don't fool with it. So we look at this original leaf spring and compare it to the brand new leaf spring from Steiner, and you'll notice, oh, this one is bent. That's pretty normal, actually. So that being said, we can go ahead and reinstall the brand new leaf spring. Just not rocket science whatsoever. Now, it's important, and we'll come back in a second and get a shot from the other side and show you why it's important to make sure this is in alignment. Alright, so we've got the new leaf spring in place, and I'm going to go ahead and get the set screw started. Now when I do that, it's important. Now there are several different styles of governor arms and methods by which the spring is adjustable, the way that works. So we'll go ahead and get everything tight into place. Now in this case, we've got a screw and a jam nut that control the amount of push. So when you pull your throttle back, it pushes against that, and it would shut your throttle fly on the carburetor. Okay, so we've got the leaf spring installed, the brand new part from Steiner. Now we'll have some adjustment to do once we get the throttle linkage and the throttle friction control plate hooked back up. Now some folks may wonder, is it important in the orientation of this of which way the end of the leaf spring is bent? Now, speaking in terms of geometry, yes. However, the threaded rod, the adjustable part on the end of the rod between here and the throttle control, the speed control lever, it's all adjustable, so it really doesn't make any difference in the relationship of that. Unless you are just replacing this leaf spring, the orientation really doesn't make any difference. If you're only replacing the leaf spring, you probably should observe which side this end curls to and replace your original with a new one in the same relation. But really, you still should go through the adjustment procedure to ensure that your idle and fast engine idle speed are correct, as well as the governor throttle response. So when reassembling the new friction disc or the plate with the speed control lever, we want to make sure that everything's in the proper orientation, because you'll notice there's 3 holes that hold it on. Now also note that this is a later style for the late 20 series and 30 series tractors. There is a different style, different shape. It's actually a solid plate with slots in it for these dowel pins to operate in for the earlier 20 series, as well as the complete number series, the 50, 60, and 70 tractors. So that being said, we check this for the proper orientation, because these 3 holes, this is not a symmetrical part. So if you reverse it, you wouldn't have the proper geometry. So just looking at the holes in the dash and looking at this, we know this is correct. This lever is always down, so we will go ahead and note that I have cleaned the dowel pins and put an anti-seize on them. Not too much, you don't want to get it on the friction control linings. And I don't have a new spring at the moment, but if your spring is broken like mine, I would highly recommend seeking out a proper replacement for it. Although this is not rocket science, it doesn't have to be down within a given tolerance. Well, there we go, we got it started. And what we'll do, we'll be adjusting the spring tension essentially, and this is something we'll have to fine-tune after the fact. It would help if I would move that the right way. After the fact, to make sure we can still adjust our lever, but that it has enough friction so that it holds it in place and our speed stays whatever position the lever is set in is where it stays. So we'll be installing this in a bit, but before that, and I'm not going to show it in the video for purpose, but I would highly recommend freeing this bolt and the jam nut up, because very likely we're going to need to adjust that when we get back on the tractor. Alright, so we got our speed control lever mounted back in the dash pedestal, or the steering support pedestal, with these 3 cap screws. Something I found out just by accident, there happens to be one of these cap screws is longer than the others. Doubt that's factory, but I had the long one in one of the lower spots, and it limited the travel of the speed control lever. So if you happen to replace it with new bolts, refer to your parts catalog, make sure that you put the proper length bolt. You don't want it too long, at least in the bottom 2 bolts, that it could limit the travel of the speed control lever. So we've got just about the right feel for the control lever, and I can't say exactly how many pounds that is, but it feels about right. I'm pretty confident, based on experience, that setting is going to be right. You don't want it too tight, but you want it snug enough that the vibration of the engine isn't going to cause, under the spring tension here, isn't going to cause the speed control to go from, say, 1250 RPM to 1100. Especially when you're on a tractor drive, you don't want to be driving with your hand on the throttle lever the whole time, holding it wide open, because it won't stay open. If you need to adjust it, trust the old 5/8 wrench, and of course with your hood off, it's much easier to get access to the bolt, and you just tighten it right in there to put more friction on this speed control lever. So we're going to go ahead and hook up our linkage to the leaf spring that we replaced earlier using a new cotter key. There we go. Now we're set up. Everything's installed back. Now what we're still going to have to do is adjust the speed control lever per the book. And we'll be right back with that. Okay folks, we're starting out at about 300 RPM. And what we're going to do the rod on the speed control and the swivel, those two nuts, while making sure that stop screw, there's a bolt that goes through the governor arm. It's got a jam nut on it. We'll screw that all the way in, and we want to get 600 RPM. And it's important that the book states to note that there should be the leaf spring on the governor should not be touching the stop rod or that stop bolt. So we're going to tighten this nut up back here. The engine's starting to speed up now. We're at about 400. There's about 450. 500. We're going to try to get to 6. Alright, so we're going to adjust this stop screw in the governor arm right there so that the stop pin and the throttle fly have exactly 1/8 inch between them, just like so. And I've used a feeler gauge and stacked it up to 125 thousandths or 1/8 inch. So we'll make that adjustment and then we'll check our speeds. Alright, so the next step in this process of adjusting our engine and getting the speeds right and the governor set up properly is we have went ahead and disconnected the speed control shaft from the governor arm to the throttle fly on our carburetor. And what we're going to do is set the idle mixtures, because this is a duplex carburetor. We're going to adjust the idle mixtures on each cylinder separately. So starting out, we're going to start the engine and manually holding the throttle fly. We're going to adjust the stop screw so that we obtain a reading of 600 RPMs. And from there, we're going to disconnect spark plug wire from number 1 using these or a pair of pliers that are not a conductive material. Otherwise, you're going to find out what it feels like to come near death. Yeah, that's a pretty good one right there. I'm regular Jay Leno. So we'll do that while it's running. And so we disconnect the wire from the number 1 cylinder, and we'll go to the other side and adjust the idle screw, the idle mixture screw, on the number 2 cylinder, since it's the one that's actually running our engine. And we're going to adjust the idle mixture screw until the engine speed is at the fastest it's going to get. And using our tachometer on the end of the clutch pulley, we're going to find out what that reading is and write it down. Then we're going to replace the spark plug wire that we had disconnected, hook it back up, and disconnect the other side, and do the same procedure for the number 1 circuit. And whichever one is fastest is the one we're going to turn it down to meet the one at the slowest speed to even out the cylinders. So that's what we're going to do, and I'll try to catch a little video of this process, and hopefully you won't get to see anybody jumping up in the air like a leprechaun getting shocked. Here we are getting our engine to 600 RPMs. A little faster, we're at about 400. So to make this adjustment, we're turning the screw in on the idle faster. A little more. A little more. so that if you're, for instance, going down a hill and you're throttling back to control your speed, it forces your throttle fly closed so that you can actually decelerate and use your engine to hold the tractor and whatever load you might have back on the hill. So we're going to set, we've set this to 300, checking again on the crankshaft using our tachometer. Then we'll rehook up to all the linkage and it should idle at 600 RPMs. It's also important to watch, you almost need extra hands because this is a later carburetor, it's got that little spring. Now we should be back at 600 RPM. Check at 600. Right at about 5. You may do